we're diving into the lives of shift workers and especially with a focus on their sleep patterns. Now, the National Health Foundation encourages everyone to have sleep of anywhere between 7 to 8 hours. If you look at the population, 50% of the population will be considered shift workers when it comes to sleep because of that fact. There is a higher likelihood that you can develop depression and anxiety as a result of poor sleep. And if you go down the line, you can go down from diabetes, obesity, and also breast cancer, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and heart disease. So there's a lot of factors that get affected when your sleep is reduced or you're getting poor sleep, and especially if you're a shift worker. If we look at the facts that we know how sleep affects you in terms of cancer, in terms of hypertension, diabetes, and other issues that it can cause medically, changing your career where it suits your lifestyle is not a bad thing at all. In a world tailored for 9 to 5, where does that leave the night owls or even shift workers, or even for that matter, the parents that are waking up at 3 a.m. to take care of their children? Now, if you're a shift worker and you have issues with sleep or you're wondering how you can improve your sleep, this episode is for you. Now, welcome back to this episode. We're diving into the lives of shift workers and especially with a focus on their sleep patterns. Now, the National Health Foundation encourages everyone to have sleep of anywhere between 7 to 8 hours. Now, we know these numbers are great when you work a job where you're working 9 to 5 and you sort of have a rhythm to your lifestyle. But when you work shift work, whereby sometimes your shift starts at 10 o'clock in the morning, sometimes it's 2 p.m., or sometimes you're doing the night shift, and then after a few days going back into a morning shift, this would be the definition of shift workers. But unfortunately, if you actually look into what the definition of shift working when it comes to or as it pertains to sleep, it is anyone who sleeps later than 10 o'clock at night and is awake between 10 and 4 a.m. Now, if you look at every young person that I know, including myself, when I was at that age, as a teenager or even in your young 20s, most people are not sleeping at that time, or most people are basically awake between the periods of 10 and 4. And let's not forget, if you had a big event or even a celebration, oftentimes most people are awake. So if you look at the population, 50% of the population will be considered shift workers when it comes to sleep because of that fact. Now, the biggest problem we have is that as a shift worker, you can't control your hours. Now, I remember myself as a young doctor and even in medical school, but really mostly when I was a young doctor, I would work periods where I would essentially be working through the night and then maybe getting away with an hour's sleep or even a bit less and getting back to the next day and working again. I got so used to it that right now, if there's any sound in a room, I would pretty much get up immediately because I'm just sort of trained that way. Now, at that time, no one would have told me that this would affect my life or this would be affecting my health. We just did it because that's what you do in the industry that you're in. And for a lot of nurses, that's essentially their life right now, whereby they spend all their time working through different shifts and trying to find a medium whereby they can get some rest and get some sleep and getting some sort of routine. Now, there are multiple industries. There's the aviation industry, there's retail, there's hospitality, whereby there is a lot of shift work and it's just part of the culture and just part of how the industries work. So today I thought I would essentially look at breaking down how the different patterns of or how shift work can essentially affect your sleep. And we'll probably start by talking about the circadian rhythm. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I like to really keep it simple because that's just how I learn. And I just feel that will be a lot easier for you as well if you just keep it to the basics. So when you look at the circadian rhythm, essentially you're looking at almost an internal clock in your brain that basically regulates a lot of hormones and also regulates the amount of energy that you have in your body and how active you are, how focused you are, and also how sleepy you get. And how it does this is by the regulation of certain hormones that basically are almost signals to it to say that it's time to sleep. So for example, if you've heard of melatonin, which a lot of people take now in the form of a tablet or a medication, when you have high levels of melatonin, which is a hormone, it basically signals to your brain that it's time to get ready for sleep. The same way, if you have a lot of bright light, this basically signals your brain that it's essentially time to get up and stay focused. So when you look at your circadian rhythm, essentially what we're looking for is a way to signal to it that it's time to either go to sleep or it's time to get ready. And that for that same reason, when you get light in the morning, it's almost a signal to your body to start to increase cortisol, which is, it's called a stress hormone, but it's actually a part of our biology, and it's also a part of our physiology in terms of how it actually functions. And you want to get those cortisol spikes high early in the morning, and then you want them to reduce late at night so that you're not feeling stressed and it's not getting you active. And so when we talk about the circadian rhythm, the next issue we need to look at is the problem with sleep is that if you have a set time where you sleep and a set time you wake up, that is perfect. But when you're a shift worker, essentially you might be sleeping at midnight one day, or even sleeping at 6 o'clock in the morning because you've had night shifts. And so your internal clock or circadian rhythm can get out of whack. And so as a parent as well, I can imagine the nights, and I still probably go through it, where you have children waking up at 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and if you have different or many other kids in the house, they might not be synced at the same time. And so you might find yourself waking up multiple times. Again, you will be considered a shift worker just by the fact that you're doing that. And so for many years, I've personally felt that I've been sleeping 4 to 6 hours, and obviously it was part of my medical life that led me into sleeping that little hours and kind of getting enough sleep that I felt that I could potentially get up and function, when in reality I was probably only getting 60 or 70, 60, 50 or 60% of my energy was actually spent the next day with focus, because I just was so tired and exhausted and not rested. And so today I'm actually going to break down some of the things that I think that would help people that are shift workers. But before I talk about what are the things you can do if you're a shift worker to get you sleep, I'm going to give you some of the facts that we know now that affects people that get poor sleep. Now, if you're getting poor sleep or you're a shift worker, we do know that if you have a very stressful work environment, and obviously with nurses, doctors, even pilots for that matter, or people that are in hospitality where things can be quite stressful, there is a higher likelihood that you can develop depression and anxiety as a result of poor sleep. And if you go down the line, you can go down from diabetes, obesity, and also breast cancer, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and heart disease. So there's a lot of factors that get affected when your sleep is reduced or you're getting poor sleep, and especially if you're a shift worker. Reduce immunity, because obviously your energy levels are low, so you can either get sick more often or even feel a lot more run down or feel more fatigued as a result of poor sleep. And not to forget performance. Now, that goes without saying. If you're not sleeping enough, you might be running on 50 to 60% the next day, and your performance is definitely going to drop. So the key takeaways here in order to improve your sleep, because if you're a shift worker, this is your life. This is what you've been doing, unless you change job, obviously, but this is what is your life day to day. So what can you do to improve it? Let's start with some of the basics, which are going to sound boring, but is very important. And one of them is nutrition. You need to try to eat healthy when you can during the day. So as much as possible, eat healthy, eat good nutritious food, try to avoid oily and fatty foods. It just goes without saying. And more importantly, try to avoid eating these kind of foods, especially late at night. So if you're used to sleeping, or you have shifts where you're doing night shifts, oftentimes people doing night shifts make really poor decisions. And for that same reason, when you're tired and you're exhausted and your clocks really not in sync, you tend to eat sweets, you tend to eat sugar because you crave for them, and you also tend to eat unhealthy food because that's really the time you make poor decisions. So try to keep your diet as clean as you can. The next would be consistent with your eating schedule. Now, I kind of touched on it with the nutrition and eating well, but try to have a schedule that works for you. Even if you work a night shift, try to keep your schedules at the same time so that let's say you finish your night shift, you have breakfast, and you either get back into sleep, or if you find it hard to get back into sleep, to stay awake until you can have lunch and then get some rest, get back into sleep and go back to the night shift. So try to have a consistent routine. Post-shift movement. Now, this is one where it can be tricky because at the end of a very hard shift, whether you're working till midnight or you're working overnight, the last thing you probably want to do is exercise. I would recommend that if you work a night shift, when you actually finish your work in the morning, I would actually recommend to exercise and do some sort of movement whereby you're getting some movement in your body. It doesn't have to be an intense workout. It doesn't have to be a run. It could be a walk. It's just to get the body going, and then you can get back into your day, whether it's resting, sleeping, or whatever takes your fancy. Now, if you work a late shift where you finish at midnight, then potentially getting that workout a lot earlier on is probably better, because even though you might feel a little bit tired, at least you get your body moving so that you get yourself back into sleeping once you finish that shift. So try to get as much movement as you can. Red light therapy. Now, red light therapy is a funny thing because if you're in a cockpit as a pilot, I don't think you're going to turn on red light so that it stimulates your brain so that you don't have melatonin sort of in your system, so that it's not actually causing you to get sleepy, but it actually regulates a lot of the hormones in your body. And so for that reason, a lot of people feel that it helps the sleep cycles by having the red light. But I just think that it just depends what kind of job you have. And it's going to be impossible if you work in a hospital, for example, and you have red lights on. Consistent scheduling. Now, this is a very tricky one because for those that actually do shift work, if they know they do night shift every week for the next year and they know the days they're off, they know the days they have to work, that's easy. But in many industries, you're sometimes working at 2 o'clock, you're sometimes working at midnight. It can be impossible. But as much as possible, if you can control that, whereby you have runs where if you've done night shift, you have time off, and then you get back into a morning routine. I think the worst that a lot of people do, and especially in the nursing industry, would be the late earlies, whereby you finish late at 10 o'clock and then you're back again in the morning. It also happens to doctors, obviously. I think that is often the hardest because you're not quite sure. You really have broken your routine already, and then going straight from night and getting back in the morning, you need a little bit of downtime. So for a lot of shift workers, once you finish work, you need a little bit of downtime before you get back into work. And that can be a little bit difficult. But if you can get it consistent and you can kind of try to get your scheduling right, I think this would be a great thing that you can probably incorporate into your lifestyle. Optimizing your sleep environment. Now, we do know that if you have light, it's going to reduce your melatonin. You're going to be waking up. So if you're driving from work after a night shift and you got bright sunlight in your face, it's going to wake you up, which is why a lot of people find it hard to get back into sleep. One thing you could do is wear really dark shades that essentially blocks out a lot of sunlight, go straight back home and go to sleep. That's if you're doing sort of night shift. If you're doing sort of late evening shifts, essentially it's not really a big factor because it's going to be dark, and essentially you can kind of get yourself back into sleep. The other thing you want to optimize is that when you're sleeping, especially if you've had night shift, is that you want everything to be dark in your room and in sort of a temperature that works for your body. And again, you got to work out what works for you, but in a really dark place, this is going to probably do the most benefit for you straight after a night shift. And finally, and this has affected me a lot, but this is something that a lot of people have, and it's sleep anxiety. And it's a real thing whereby you feel that you've only had 3 hours of sleep. How are you going to function today? And then you start questioning yourself, and you actually feel a lot more tired because you feel like it's been such a long shift. and you really needed that sleep, but you didn't get it, and you start sort of worrying about how much sleep you're going to get. Now, you can't do anything about this. All you can do is focus on optimizing the areas that you have and trying to focus on what you can control. So if you're going to go to bed and for some reason you can't get to bed, and then you get up, and when you look at people's advice for sleep hygiene, it's about drinking milk and doing all those things. But the reality is you got to find something that works for you. And if you didn't get that 3 hour or 6 or 7 hours sleep that you wanted to, and you ended up getting 3 hours, I think the focus is the next day and how you can get that rest back. And for some people, one thing to do is to do napping, which you can do, especially if you're working a night shift and you didn't get enough rest. But getting a bit of napping, that can help as well. And finally, I left this for the end because it's important. It's an important fact. And it's really considering a career shift. Now, for a lot of people, it's not something that they want to do because they love what they do and maybe the shift work is not great. But considering a career shift is not a bad thing if the work that you do is not something that you love anymore or you don't enjoy. Because in the long run, if we look at the facts that we know how sleep affects you in terms of cancer, in terms of hypertension, diabetes, and the other issues that it can cause medically, changing your career where it suits your lifestyle is not a bad thing at all. And if you're in that boat, I think it's something you should consider. Now, there's a lot of information if you have a regular lifestyle, but as a shift worker, there's still not a lot of evidence on what can help. I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about essentially, I think, fire people that worked in emergency services, fire trucks and things like that. And essentially how their lives have been affected by optimizing nutrition, optimizing a pattern that could help them. And they've found that it has helped some industries when it comes to shift work. But again, there's still not a lot of research in this field because people have not focused on shift workers as much, even though there's a huge amount of people that live a life of shift working. In conclusion, while the evidence is out there that sleep is very important, especially for people who have regular lifestyles, there is still not a lot of studies for those that have or work in shift jobs that have or careers that have a lot of shift work, especially night shift work. And so my takeaway from this would be that you can only control what you can, and the focus should be to optimize your sleep as much as you can while still being able to perform at work and without getting into the sleep anxiety of not feeling you've got enough sleep. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it with someone that needs to hear this. And also do not forget to subscribe to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And I will catch you on the next episode.